It began with a push, not a shove, but a quiet, steady nudge eastward from the craggy fjords and cold spray of Scandinavia. In the 8th and 9th centuries, long before frozen Moscow or the Kremlin's spires, Norse seafarers climbed into dragon-headed ships and slipped into the cold waters of the Baltic Sea. These were not the wild-eyed berserkers of popular imagination, not yet. Many were traders, opportunists, even explorers chasing whispers of furs, silver, and land along the forested river routes of an unknown world, the vast, misty expanses of what is now Russia. The lands to the east weren't empty. Slavic tribes dwelled among the thick forests and wide rivers, living in scattered, loosely organized communities. The Norse called them gerr, or enclosures, a fitting name for the ringed settlements they encountered. But it wasn't conquest that marked the early years. It was commerce. Viking ships crept up the Gulf of Finland, pushing inland via the Dnieper River and into Lake Ladoga. Here, they discovered the Folkhof River, a watery corridor stretching into the heart of a continent. Settlements like Staraya Ladoga, Aldegeborg, to the Norse, sprang up as outposts, midway stations for men with iron axes and big ambitions. At first, they traded, amber for furs, tools for wax, swords for honey. But as Norse presence grew, so did tensions. The newcomers were better armed, better organized, and often more ruthless. Clashes erupted, but so did bonds. Intermarriage, alliances, and necessity blurred the lines. These Vikings weren't tourists. They began staying through winters, building homes, forging communities. It wasn't all harmony. Among themselves, the Norse were fractious. They came not as a unified nation, but as rival bands and ambitious individuals. Yet what united them was a vision: to turn the winding rivers of Eastern Europe into a new lifeline for trade and power. And the rivers, those ancient veins of water, offered paths to glory. From Lake Ladoga, they pushed down the Folkhof to Lake Ilmen, and further south along the Lovat River. Here, boats had to be carried overland, portage, to reach the Dnieper or Volga, linking to mighty cities far beyond Slavic lands. To the south lay Byzantium, glittering and rich. To the east, the caliphates of Baghdad, alien and alluring. The Norse had found a new frontier, not of frozen wastes, but of forests, rivers, and empires. It was rough going. The terrain was swampy and treacherous, with gnats, bears, and wolves aplenty. But the Norse thrived in challenge. They fortified their stations, learned the river bends, and grew fluent in local customs. Soon, they were no longer just raiders or merchants. They were settlers. Some became lords over Slavic villages, others guardians of trade routes, and some simply stayed behind, carving out a life under the canopy of Russian trees. By the mid-9th century, a new identity had begun to form, not quite Norse, not quite Slavic. They called themselves Rus. The name's origin is debated, but one strong theory links it to rods, or rowers, an apt title for people whose lives depended on oars, rivers, and muscle. The term spread, first used to describe the newcomers, then embraced by locals. Soon, it wasn't just a people. It was a concept, a rising force. Alongside the birth of this hybrid culture came the spread of Norse values and systems. From their own traditions, they brought a rough legal code, a warrior ethos, and an appetite for organized leadership. But the Slavic influence softened them, introduced agricultural rhythms, local dialects, and different gods. It was a strange mix, but it worked. Downstream, rumors trickled toward Constantinople. The emperor had heard of these tall, fair-haired men controlling rivers and building towns. In time, they'd come knocking at the gates of Byzantium itself, but not yet. First, they had to build a kingdom. And so, from fjords to forests, the Vikings had found a new world, not one they would pillage and leave behind, but one they would help shape. The rivers had spoken, and the Norse had listened. In the years that followed their early eastward forays, the Norsemen, by now known increasingly as the Rus, did more than trade and travel. They started to settle permanently, and their identities began to fuse with those of the Slavic tribes they once merely passed by. The Viking expansion into Russia was no longer just a story of brave journeys and loaded ships. It was becoming a story of transformation. As the 9th century advanced, more Norsemen, many from Sweden, crossed the Baltic and made their way inland, not just to profit, but to stay. Settlements like Ladoga were soon joined by others deeper inland, Izborsk, Belozersk, and eventually Novgorod. These weren't crude raider camps. They were proto-towns, trading hubs and cultural crossroads where Scandinavian runes might be carved on one wall, and Slavic songs echo through the next. The locals didn't always welcome the newcomers. At times, Slavic tribes resisted Norse dominance. At other times, they invited it. The Norse brought stability and protection along trade routes that were otherwise dangerous and fragmented. In some places, the Slavs asked the Rus to rule them, as the now legendary tale of the invitation of the Varangians suggests. According to this story, told in the primary chronicle, centuries later, Slavic tribes, weary of internal conflict, invited a Norse prince named Rurik and his kin to bring order. Whether myth or fact, it captures a truth: Viking power in the East wasn't always taken by the sword. Often, it was negotiated, agreed upon, and absorbed. The Rus weren't just imposing their culture, they were blending it. Pagan beliefs from Scandinavia intermingled with Slavic deities. Burial practices, clothing styles, and even language began to meld. A man might bear a Norse name and worship Perun, the Slavic thunder god. Or a Slavic chieftain might take a Norse bride and raise their children to row like Vikings and pray like Slavs. It was cultural osmosis, and it happened over generations, not decades. Out of this fusion, something new was taking shape, a people no longer entirely Scandinavian, nor entirely Slavic. A people who could navigate both northern fjords and southern steppe, who understood both the hammer of Thor and the axe of Perun, and who were learning how to govern territory, not just conquer it. This was the birth of the Rus. Not just as a name, but as a nation in the making. They were now deeply embedded in Eastern Europe, not just as visitors, but as settlers, rulers, and shapers of the future. As they grew in strength, so did their ambitions. Novgorod, a town founded by the Volga River, emerged as a key stronghold. It became a center of trade, diplomacy, and military strength. Boats left its docks bound for distant markets. Envoys rode from its walls to neighboring tribes. Norse-style assemblies, or things, where free men debated decisions, were held on its soil. And above it all loomed the figure of Rurik, the man who would come to symbolize the beginning of Rus leadership. Rurik's rule, according to tradition, began around 862 AD. He established a base in Novgorod and laid the foundations for a dynasty that would shape Russian history for centuries. He wasn't alone. He ruled alongside his brothers at first, but by the time of his death, his lineage had taken root. This new dynasty didn't just control Novgorod. It began to expand southward, following the lifeblood of the rivers. Control of the river trade meant control of wealth, influence, and power. And south, at the convergence of Dnieper routes, was a glittering prize waiting to be claimed: Kiev. But before the Rus could take it, they had to consolidate who they were. The fusion of Norse and Slavic was not a one-time event. It was a slow, sticky process involving families, rituals, conflicts, and trade deals. In some ways, it was as simple as a Norse blacksmith teaching a Slavic apprentice to forge a blade. In other ways, it was as complex as shared rituals at burial mounds, where Odin might be whispered in one breath, and Veles in the next. The Rus identity hardened over time. Their dialects took on local flavors. Their clothing began to blend furs from the north with embroidery from the east. Their leaders began to draft laws, raise militias, and rule with a mixture of Norse bluntness and Slavic wisdom. By the late 9th century, the Rus were not just a scattered network of Norsemen abroad. They were a people with direction, with goals, with vision. and their next move would change the map of Eastern Europe forever. With the groundwork laid in Novgorod and the cultural roots of the Rus beginning to take hold, it was only a matter of time before the energy of expansion turned southward. The Dnieper River beckoned, a mighty liquid road stretching toward the Black Sea, toward Byzantium, and toward the great prize of Kiev. It was along these southern currents that the Rus would stake their boldest claim yet, guided by a figure who would leave a permanent mark on Eastern European history, Rurik's successor, Oleg of Novgorod. Rurik died around 879 AD, but before passing, he entrusted the care of his young son, Igor, to his trusted companion and relative, Oleg. Whether Oleg was a kinsman or simply a capable warrior is still debated, but what's certain is that Oleg was no placeholder. He was a conqueror with a vision, and Kiev was his target. At the time, Kiev was already a Slavic settlement of significance, held by two rulers known as Askold and Dnieper, possibly fellow Norsemen who had carved out a fief of their own. But Oleg, recognizing the strategic and economic value of Kiev, perched as it was on the crossroads of major trade and communication, moved to take it. Using a mixture of cunning and might, Oleg orchestrated the deaths of Askold and Dnieper around 882 and claimed the city in the name of Rurik's line. With that, the power center of the Rus shifted. Kiev became the new seat, the jewel of the river routes, and the launching pad for a state that would be remembered as the Kievan Rus. Oleg declared Kiev the mother of Rus cities, and it was more than poetic flourish. From there, he consolidated territory north and south along the Dnieper, forged alliances, and established the beginnings of centralized rule. He didn't just conquer, he connected. Tribes were brought under tribute, cities linked by roads and rivers, and laws enforced across a growing domain. To secure both prestige and prosperity, Oleg also looked outward, to the empire to the south. In 907, he launched a daring campaign against Constantinople. According to the chronicles, Oleg's forces arrived at the gates of the Byzantine capital and, in one of the most theatrical moments of the saga, he nailed his shield to the city's gates. Whether the event happened exactly as told or not, the results were real. The Byzantines agreed to a treaty in 911, granting the Rus favorable trade terms and solidifying their status as a regional power. This victory wasn't merely military, it was diplomatic. The Rus had forced the great Eastern Roman Empire to recognize them as equals in negotiation. No longer were they simply raiders or mercenaries. They were rulers, ambassadors, and players in a much larger game. Under Oleg and later Igor, Rurik's now-grown son, the Kievan Rus grew stronger. Igor, however, lacked his guardian's finesse. In 945, while collecting tribute from the Drevlians, one of the Slavic tribes under Rus control, Igor pressed too hard. The Drevlians retaliated savagely, killing him in an ambush that would trigger a legendary episode in Rus history, the revenge of his wife, Olga. Olga of Kiev is one of the most compelling figures of the early Rus state. A woman of cunning and iron will, she assumed power as regent for her young son Sviatoslav and carried out a brutal, but calculated, campaign against the Drevlians. According to the tales, her vengeance involved ambushes, executions, and even a siege that ended with flaming birds setting an enemy city ablaze. Whether every detail is literal or embellished, one thing is certain: Olga ruled with force and vision. And she held the state together during a period when it could have fractured. But Olga's reign wasn't just about vengeance. She laid the groundwork for reforms, strengthened the central government, and notably, became the first Rus ruler to convert to Christianity after a visit to Constantinople. This planted the seeds of a transformation that would blossom under her grandson Vladimir. Back in Kiev, the Rus were evolving rapidly. Fortified by trade, tempered by intertribal conflict, and inspired by a blend of Norse drive and Slavic endurance, they continued to expand. Their state was still young, rough-edged, and held together more by personalities than institutions, but it had direction. The rivers they had once used for travel were now highways of administration, taxation, and power. The Rurikid dynasty, born with Rurik and sharpened by Oleg and Olga, was now entrenched. And it had survived the kind of early stumbles that toppled other new states. Ahead lay even greater tests, and greater transformations. But the core had been forged. The Rus were no longer just descendants of wandering Norsemen. They were a people, a dynasty, and a force. And soon, they would face choices that would change not just their kingdom, but their soul. By the mid-10th century, the Rus had established themselves as more than a wandering people or a tribal overlordship. With Kiev as their base, the rivers as their lifelines, and trade as their fuel, the Kievan Rus were growing into a true medieval state. And it was on those same rivers, especially the mighty Dnieper, that their power reached far beyond the forests and fields of Eastern Europe. The Rus were obsessed with the Dnieper. Not just for its beauty or size, but for its purpose. This river connected their northern forests to the Black Sea, and beyond that, to Constantinople, the legendary city of gold-domed churches, silk-draped markets, and imperial splendor. This was the dream destination, the southern star in every Rus trader's and warlord's eye. Their journeys were daring. These weren't calm, leisurely cruises. They were brutal expeditions through wild terrain, against fierce currents, and through hostile territory. Along the Dnieper, treacherous rapids lay in wait, each one named, feared, and prepared for. Ships had to be unloaded and dragged across land to avoid the worst of them. Raiders, rival tribes, and wild animals threatened at every bend. But the Rus went anyway. And when they arrived at Constantinople, called Miklagard by the Norse, they didn't always come peacefully. Under Prince Sviatoslav, son of Olda and Igor, the Rus became more than traders. They were now conquerors. Sviatoslav wasn't interested in diplomacy. He wanted glory, and lots of it. He led massive campaigns not just southward, but eastward into the Volga region and against the Khazar Khaganate, a powerful, multi-ethnic state controlling trade between the Caspian and Black Seas. The Khazars had once collected tribute from Slavic tribes. Now, the Rus would flip the script. Sviatoslav's campaigns were brutal, swift, and effective. He shattered the Khazars, seized key fortresses like Sarkel, and extended Rus influence deep into the steppe. He then turned his eyes to the Balkans, taking on the First Bulgarian Empire and even challenging the might of Byzantium once more. This alarmed Constantinople enough that they brokered a fragile peace, and then arranged for his assassination when the time was right. On his return from one such campaign in 972, Sviatoslav was ambushed by Pecheneg, a nomadic tribe, and killed. Legend says his skull was turned into a drinking cup. A grim end, perhaps, but in keeping with the brutal glory he had sought his entire life. Though he died, Sviatoslav's vision of expansion through warfare and trade left its mark. His sons inherited not just territory but ambition. Infighting followed, as it so often did, but eventually one son rose above the rest, Vladimir. And with Vladimir, a new era dawned, one not of raiding, but of reshaping the soul of the Rus. But before that transformation, it's worth reflecting on what the Rus had already accomplished. By now, they were a people spread across rivers and forests, towns and steppes. Their roots were still half Norse, but their branches had grown into a distinctly Eastern European tree. They had no castles yet, no great cathedrals, but they had a system. Trade routes, tribute networks, alliances with local tribes, and an evolving sense of identity. They weren't unified in the way Western kingdoms were. Local lords still held great sway, and succession was often chaotic. But they had something just as powerful: connectivity. From Novgorod to Kiev, from the Gulf of Finland to the shores of the Black Sea, the Rus network spanned thousands of miles. They had become the bridge between cultures, Norse and Slavic, pagan and Christian, forest and steppe, Baltic and Byzantine. Their economy thrived on this bridging role. Furs from the north, honey and wax from the forests, slaves from conquered territories, and silver from the Muslim world all passed through Rus hands. Viking-style riverboats called monoxyla glided up and down the Dnieper, packed with goods, warriors, and ambition. Even the famed Varangian Guard of Byzantium, elite warriors who guarded the emperor himself, was made up largely of Rus mercenaries. The Rus, in short, were no longer outsiders. They were insiders everywhere. Insiders to northern trade, insiders to southern politics, insiders to a rapidly changing medieval world. But their identity was still shifting, still in flux. They had the bones of a kingdom, but not yet the heart. That would come with Vladimir. But first, it had to come with a choice. Who would they become? Would they remain a people of many gods and many loyalties? Or would they choose one path, one faith, one foundation? The rivers had carried them far. But now, something else would begin to shape their journey, not the current, but belief. When Vladimir came to power near the end of the 10th century, the Kievan Rus had muscle, gold, and fame. But what they lacked was unity of purpose. The Norse gods still whispered from deep traditions, Slavic spirits still rustled in the forests, and Christianity was already nibbling at the edges of belief systems. Vladimir, the grandson of Olga and son of Sviatoslav, understood something profound. A kingdom could only truly cohere if it shared a soul. And so Vladimir, Prince of Kiev, warrior by blood, and politician by necessity, set out to find one. The tale of his conversion has the flavor of myth, but like many myths, it reflects deeper truths. As the story goes, Vladimir sent envoys across the known world to examine the great religions of the time. They visited the Muslim world, observed Jewish rituals, explored Western Latin Christianity, and finally arrived in Constantinople, where they witnessed the grand liturgy of the Orthodox Church at the Hagia Sophia. Their report back to Vladimir was filled with awe. They said they didn't know whether they were in heaven or on earth. The brilliance of the Orthodox ceremony, its incense, icons, and chanting, had captured their hearts. Vladimir made his decision. In 988 AD, he converted to Christianity, Eastern Orthodoxy specifically, and commanded the same of his people. But Vladimir didn't just dip a toe in faith. He dove in fully, linking religion with power in a move that transformed the Rus forever. He married the Byzantine princess Anna, sister of the Emperor Basil II, sealing a political alliance that elevated the Rus to a new level of prestige. And then, in an extraordinary show of royal will, he ordered the mass baptism of Kiev's population in the Dnieper River. Imagine the scene: thousands of people, young and old, standing waist-deep in the water, priests chanting, icons raised toward the sky. It was a moment of rebirth, not just for individuals but for a civilization. Christianity brought more than new rituals. It brought literacy, in the form of Church Slavonic. It brought art and architecture, as wooden shrines gave way to domes and frescoes. It brought monks and missionaries, who copied texts, taught children, and preserved the knowledge that would shape generations. And it brought a new kind of legitimacy, a divine endorsement for the power of the Rurikid princes. For the Rus, it meant entry into the club of Christian kingdoms, a necessary step for diplomacy and trade. For Vladimir, it meant spiritual and political consolidation. Pagan idols were cast down, literally, some thrown into the river. Pagan priests lost their hold. And over time, the people adapted. Slowly, the duality of Norse and Slavic gods faded, replaced by crosses and candles. This wasn't without resistance. Some communities clung to their old beliefs. Some villages likely practiced a blend of Christian and pagan rites for decades, even centuries. But the tide had turned. The Rus were now Christian, and their identity would never be the same. Vladimir's reign saw more than spiritual change. He also codified laws, improved infrastructure, and supported education through monastic institutions. Kiev began to resemble the great cities of Europe and Byzantium, not only in layout, but in ambition. The state was no longer a riverbound trading coalition. It was a kingdom, in every sense of the word. His successors inherited this foundation. Yaroslav the Wise, his son, would go on to promote justice, build cathedrals, and marry his daughters into the royal families of Europe. The Kievan Rus reached a cultural golden age, with art, diplomacy, and commerce flourishing. But none of it could have happened without Vladimir's gamble, his leap from sword to scripture. The Dnieper, once a highway for raiders and rowers, had now become a river of faith. And the Norse legacy? Still present, but quieter now. The swords were still sharp, but they were increasingly sheathed in the name of peace, law, and the gospel. Yet the Rus had not forgotten who they were. Even as churches rose in Kiev, even as bells rang over Novgorod, there remained in the blood of the people a memory of longboats, of harsh winters and harder men, of gods once worshipped on hilltops. The Christian Rus had not killed the Viking soul. It had merely baptized it. And so, Vladimir's legacy was not just one of religion, it was one of transformation. He gave the Rus not just a god, but a future. He bound their hearts to a new purpose. And in doing so, he ended the age of pagan warlords and ushered in the age of kings and cathedrals. The Norse had come east looking for silver and furs. They found something far greater. They found a destiny. By the time the 11th century dawned, the Rus were no longer newcomers on the world stage. The wild-eyed Norse adventurers who had once rowed their boats up unknown rivers were now the stuff of ancestral legend. Their descendants wore robes instead of wolfskins, crossed themselves instead of invoking Odin, and ruled cities of stone and gold instead of timber and smoke. But as with all golden ages, the height of glory hinted at an eventual fall. The twilight of Viking influence in Rus did not come with a single battle or dramatic defeat. It faded gradually, like mist retreating from a riverbank. The Norse had not been expelled, they had been absorbed. Their language vanished from everyday use, their runes replaced by the Cyrillic script. Intermarriage, Christianity, and centuries of integration had done what no sword could do, they made the Norse indistinguishable from the Slavs they once stood apart from. This was no failure. It was transformation. But with that transformation came change. The Kievan Rus, though unified in faith and culture, were fracturing politically. As the sons and grandsons of Vladimir and Yaroslav inherited pieces of the realm, a familiar pattern emerged, one the Norse themselves had long known. Brotherhood gave way to rivalry. Ambition overcame unity. The great river network that had once connected their strength now stretched thin across competing centers of power: Kiev, Novgorod, Polotsk, Smolensk. Civil wars flared. Princes turned on each other. And while they quarreled, new threats emerged. To the east, the rising power of the steppe nomads, first the Pecheneg, then the Cumans, pressed against the borders. To the west, Polish and Hungarian kingdoms tested the edges of Rus control. And to the north, Scandinavia had changed as well. The homeland of the Rus Vikings was no longer a launching pad for expansion, it was turning inward, becoming kingdoms of its own. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway were forming into centralized Christian monarchies. Their energies were now focused on internal consolidation, crusades, and rivalries with each other, rather than adventuring across the seas. The old routes of exploration, the lifeblood of the Viking Age, were drying up. And so, as the Norse world changed, so too did the Rus. The influx of new Vikings into Eastern Europe slowed and then all but stopped. The role of Varangians in Rus politics faded. Even the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, once dominated by Scandinavians, began to fill with Anglo-Saxon exiles after the Norman conquest of England. In time, the Rurikid princes who once proudly traced their lineage to Rurik the Norseman now spoke Slavic tongues, practiced Orthodox rites, and looked to Byzantium, not Scandinavia, for their cultural touchstones. The memory of the Viking era survived in stories, in the occasional carved ornament or boat burial uncovered by archaeologists. But in daily life, it was gone. And yet, the Viking spirit left deep marks. The Rus still navigated by rivers, built with the practicality of Norse engineering, and governed with a combination of tribal assembly and princely authority that bore echoes of the thing. The boldness that had driven Norsemen to brave the rapids of the Dnieper had not disappeared, it had simply changed form. It now animated a new culture, one rooted in Slavic soil but watered by Viking blood. In the centuries to come, the Kievan Rus would decline under the pressure of internal divisions and external invasions, culminating in the Mongol conquest in the 13th century. But the legacy of the Viking Age would live on. It lived in the dynastic bloodlines of the Rurikid princes, some of whom would eventually rule in Muscovy and lay the foundations for the Russian Empire. It lived in the fortified cities built along river routes once paddled by Norse explorers. It lived in the names of towns, the structure of trade, and even in the echoes of Norse-style storytelling that wove their sagas into Slavic legends. And for those who remember to look closely, the tale of the Viking expansion into Russia is not just one of conquest or commerce. It's one of transformation, the kind that begins with the creak of oars in a cold northern bay and ends with the peal of church bells across the domes of Kiev. So the next time you hear of Vikings, don't just think of stormy seas and English coasts. Think of quiet rivers winding through forests, of Norsemen learning Slavic songs, of longboats docked at the foot of a Byzantine cathedral. Think of the Rus, the people who began as outsiders and became a nation. That's the complete story of the Viking expansion into Russia. A journey not just across land and water, but across identity itself.